If you walked into a bank today and tried to deposit a car trunk full of cash, security would be calling the police before you made it to the counter. In Miami, in 1980, that happened so often that tellers barely looked up. People came in with cash stacked on dollies, in duffel bags and cardboard boxes, with the deposit slip literally held between their teeth because their hands were full. Nobody at the bank asked where it came from. And here's the part that should genuinely surprise you. The people who first realized just how insane this had gotten weren't cops. They were accountants. In 1979, the Federal Reserve ran a routine cash flow study, the kind of report that normally puts people to sleep. What it found was not routine at all. The Federal Reserve branch covering Miami had a $5 billion cash surplus, in small bills, mostly 50s and 100s. That was more currency than all 11 other Federal Reserve districts in the entire United States combined. And this wasn't a boom year for the American economy. The rest of the country was in a recession. Every other Federal Reserve district in America was running a cash deficit. Miami was drowning in money that, on paper, wasn't supposed to exist. Here's what that actually looked like on the ground. A small, unremarkable bank, called Continental Bank, had been taking in about $12 million a year in deposits through the mid-1970s, a perfectly normal number for a bank its size. By 1980, that number was over $600 million. One money launderer named Isaac Catan reportedly once pulled up to a valet with $1 million in cash in his trunk, asked the attendant to help him carry it inside, and came back out to find the entire car had been stolen, cash and all. He was, at the time, moving as much as $500 million a year through condos overlooking Biscayne Bay. Nobody upgraded the building's security for that kind of money. Nobody asked the obvious question. The math simply didn't work unless you accounted for what everyone in Miami banking already knew, and nobody officially said out loud. The money was cocaine. Specifically, cocaine bought in Colombia for pennies on the dollar and sold on American streets for a markup so extreme it's hard to describe as a business model. A supply of cocaine base worth around $625 in the Andes could be worth $625,000 by the time it reached Miami's streets. Multiply that by the hundreds of kilos moving through the city every week, and you get a river of cash that had nowhere legitimate to go. So it went into the nearest bank, laundered through car dealerships, condos, and shell companies dressed up as normal Miami businesses. But the money was only half of what was happening. The other half was violence, and it announced itself on July 11th, 1979. A van with mismatched signs on each side, reading, "Happy Time Complete Supply Party," on one, "Happy Time Complete Party Supply," on the other, pulled up outside Dadeland, Miami's largest shopping mall. Two gunmen walked into a liquor store, shot a Colombian drug lord 4 times in the face in front of witnesses, and drove away in broad daylight through a parking lot full of shoppers. It became known as the Dadeland Mall Massacre, and it wasn't an isolated event. It was the opening act. A lot of that era's violence traced back to one particular person, Griselda Blanco, a Colombian trafficker known as La Madrina, the godmother. At her peak, she was reportedly moving 1,500 kilos of cocaine a month through Miami, netting an estimated $80 million monthly. She's also widely credited by biographers and the law enforcement officials who chased her with inventing a method of killing that Miami hadn't seen before. Gunmen on motorcycles, pulling alongside a target in traffic or outside a building, firing, and vanishing into the city within seconds. It was fast, nearly impossible to trace, and it worked. She was eventually convicted of 3 murders, though investigators believed the real number was far higher, including the accidental death of a 2-year-old boy during a hit meant for someone else. In 2012, years after being deported back to Colombia, Blanco was shot twice in the head leaving a butcher shop, killed by two hitmen on a motorcycle, the exact method she was credited with inventing. In 1979, South Florida recorded 349 murders, triple the number from just 2 years earlier. By 1981, that number had climbed to 621. Bodies turned up in car trunks, at traffic lights, on tour boats in broad daylight. The local police, by most accounts, were outgunned, outnumbered, and in some documented cases, on the payroll. If you were an ordinary Miami resident with no connection to any of this, you still felt it. Real estate agents didn't ask why a client wanted to pay all cash for a beachfront condo. Car dealers didn't ask why a customer wanted the sticker price in unmarked bills. Parents in some neighborhoods started walking their kids a different way to school once certain buildings became places you simply didn't linger near. None of that showed up in any brochure. It just became the unspoken texture of daily life in a city where asking too many questions was its own kind of risk. Here's the part that's genuinely strange to sit with. While the murder rate exploded, Miami's economy was quietly having one of the best runs in its history at the exact moment the rest of America was in a recession. Economists later estimated the drug trade supported around 25,000 legitimate jobs in construction, real estate, and banking. Dade County brought in an extra $400 million a year in sales tax alone. The number of Miami banks licensed for international transactions jumped from 10 in 1978 to 44 just a few years later. By the mid-1980s, this same city inspired a primetime television show, Miami Vice, that turned pastel suits, speedboats, and undercover detectives into a global fashion statement. Several of its plot lines were drawn almost directly from real DEA case files. And the neighborhood most associated with that glamorous image today, South Beach, with its restored Art Deco hotels and nightlife, was substantially rebuilt during this exact period, financed in part by developers who never lacked for unexplained cash looking for somewhere legitimate to land. The version of Miami the world fell in love with on television was, in large part, built by the same money that was filling the Federal Reserve's vaults a few blocks away. The federal government eventually noticed what the accountants had flagged years earlier. In 1980, an interagency task force called Operation Greenback began pulling apart Miami's banking records looking for the paper trail. In 1982, President Reagan sent hundreds of additional federal agents into South Florida specifically to deal with what the city had become. It took years, and by most honest accounts, it never fully worked. It mostly just pushed the violence and the money elsewhere, first to other parts of Florida, eventually out of the country entirely, while Miami kept the buildings the money had already paid for. So, if you'd lived an ordinary life in Miami during those years, working a regular job, banking at a regular bank, you were, whether you ever thought about it or not, standing inside an economy that a $5 billion accounting anomaly had already exposed as impossible to explain any other way. The violence made the headlines. The real story was sitting quietly in a Federal Reserve ledger the entire time, in a number nobody in Washington could explain until they stopped pretending not to understand it. If you're keeping track, this is episode 2 in the series. Next up, what it was actually like living behind the Iron Curtain in the Soviet Union. Subscribe if you want to catch that one. And if this kind of the real story was hiding in plain sight angle is your thing, a like tells me to keep making more of these.